The great hall of Zarathus stretched wider than any human eye had ever seen. Tall, polished crystal pillars reflected light from the floating orbs above, casting dancing patterns across the marble floor. Alien courtiers moved with grace, their long limbs and glimmering skin making them seem more like living statues than beings. At the center of the hall, the throne sat raised on a platform of shining metal. It was here that Princess Lyra held court, her presence commanding every eye, every thought. 27 years ago, a human named Ethan Vale had walked into this hall. He had been young, barely 25, wearing the formal robes of a human diplomat. His eyes were wide with wonder and cautious respect. He had heard stories about the Zarathian court, about the sharp tongues, the rigid customs, and the unspoken rules that no outsider could hope to understand. Yet he had walked forward without fear, representing his people with dignity. Princess Lyra had been young then too, though her confidence had already grown into something almost untouchable. She noticed the human immediately, his small frame compared to the tall, elegant aliens around him. A ripple of amusement passed through the court as he bowed carefully, following the ceremonial rules he had memorized. "You are far from your home, little human," Lyra had said, her voice ringing clear through the hall. "Tell me, do your people even have ships that can reach here without breaking apart?" The question had drawn laughter from some of the courtiers. Ethan had kept his head low, replying respectfully, "Our ships are small, Your Highness, but they are reliable. We value ingenuity over size." Lyra had tilted her head, studying him with sharp, critical eyes. "Ingenuity? Is that what you call sending tiny vessels into the void while stronger races claim the stars?" Ethan did not flinch. He answered politely, "Even small steps can take a species far, Princess. We believe in careful planning and learning from each journey." The laughter grew louder. The council whispered, mocking his quiet confidence, but Ethan remained calm. He bowed again, waiting for the formal audience to continue. Princess Lyra's amusement turned to something sharper. "A species that takes small steps yet hopes to compete with the great Zarathians?" Her eyes glimmered with mischief. "You remind me of a child pretending to be a scholar. Tell me, human, how do you plan to survive among those who are born to command?" The hall erupted with laughter. Even some of the more reserved aliens could not contain their amusement at the tiny human's bold presence. Ethan's cheeks burned slightly, but he said nothing. He straightened his back, his gaze steady, showing no sign of anger or fear. His silent composure was almost as powerful as any words. When the audience ended, Ethan bowed deeply and left the throne room. He walked slowly, making no attempt to rush or flee. The council watched him leave, some still laughing, others exchanging puzzled glances. How could a being so small and so inexperienced show such calm? His silence spoke louder than any protest or explanation. That quiet exit became the story whispered among the court for years. Some called it arrogance. Others called it courage. Either way, it left an impression, one that would remain unbroken for decades. After leaving Zarathus, Ethan returned to humanity's capital. He carried no resentment, no desire for revenge. Instead, he focused on learning, on improving, on preparing for the future. He studied the ways of diplomacy, science, and strategy. He learned from every mistake and failure, understanding that small steps taken wisely could eventually lead to giant leaps. Meanwhile, back on Zarathus, Lyra had never forgotten the human who had walked into her court so quietly, yet left a mark so loudly. Over the years, she had risen from princess to queen, facing challenges that tested her mind, her strength, and her pride. She had learned to respect power, intelligence, and composure. Still, in her heart, there remained a flicker of amusement at that day when she had mocked a small human and watched him leave without a word of complaint. For Ethan, time passed differently. Every mission, every negotiation, every innovation contributed to the slow but steady rise of humanity. By the time he reached 40, he had earned the respect of human leaders, allied species, and even some who had once doubted him. Humanity's fleets had grown larger and more advanced. Colonies had expanded to distant systems, and human knowledge had reached levels that even the most arrogant alien civilizations could not ignore. Yet Ethan did not boast. He understood that strength without humility could be dangerous. He remained careful, silent, and observant. He knew that real power did not need loud announcements. It revealed itself in results, in actions that could not be ignored. And now, 27 years later, Fate had begun to turn. A report arrived in the quiet halls of the Human Command Center. A message from a distant observer indicated that Zarathus was facing unrest. The Alien Council had become divided, rival factions questioning Queen Lyra's decisions. Trade routes were at risk, political alliances threatened, and whispers of rebellion filled the air. Ethan read the report calmly. There was no joy in another species' trouble, only the knowledge that opportunity often comes quietly, like a shadow moving across the stars. He began to plan, not with arrogance but with the precision of a human who had learned from every step of the past. Even as he worked, memories of that day in Zarathus' throne room returned. The laughter, the mockery, the sharp glance of a young princess, it all felt like a lesson. Not in humiliation but in patience, not in anger but in restraint. Across the galaxy, Lyra's court had also changed. The laughter of the past had faded into memory. The council had grown more serious, the stakes higher, and her decisions heavier. She could not ignore the subtle shifts in galactic power. The rise of humanity was no longer a story to mock. It was becoming a reality to respect. The contrast between the human who had walked away silently and the alien queen who had ruled with authority was stark. One had risen quietly, building strength step by step. The other had held power early, but now faced challenges that tested her in ways she had not expected. Ethan prepared to send his next envoy. This time it would not be a mission of apology or explanation. It would be a mission of presence, intelligence, and subtle influence. His goal was not to humiliate or boast. He simply understood that human perseverance, discipline, and dignity were forces that spoke louder than any crown or title. In a small, sleek human vessel, Ethan looked out at the stars. Each point of light represented a system, a planet, a potential friend or rival. Humanity had learned to navigate the galaxy with patience and careful strategy. No one could predict exactly what the next steps would bring. But one thing was clear. Humans did not rush, they observed, they learned. And they acted when the moment was right. Ethan's calm, steady presence had already left its mark decades ago. Now the galaxy would see how far that mark could reach. Back on Zarathus, Lyra moved through her own palace, unaware that the human she had mocked long ago was already shaping events that would soon touch her world. She made decisions, received reports, and maintained the dignity of her throne. But beneath the surface, a faint awareness stirred, a recognition that some humans carried a quiet power, one that no mocking words could diminish. The lesson of patience, dignity, and silent strength stretched across decades and light years. Ethan had learned it, lived it, and now, in the stillness of the stars, prepared to show the galaxy its value. The human who had once been laughed at was no longer a figure of amusement. He was a shadow of quiet power, moving deliberately, leaving an impact without uttering a single boastful word. As the stars passed silently outside his window, Ethan knew that the real test was yet to come. The galaxy would watch, allies and rivals alike would notice. And somewhere, perhaps, a queen who had once mocked a small human would come to realize that silence could speak louder than the loudest words. And so, 27 years after that fateful day in the throne room of Zarathus, the story of the quiet human began to unfold once more. This time, with consequences that could not be ignored, and a silent power that would shape the future of countless worlds. 27 years had changed much in the galaxy. Where humans were once considered weak and insignificant, their presence now quietly stretched across distant systems. The fleets they had built were advanced, precise, and deadly, not through sheer size but through strategy and intelligence. Colonies thrived on planets that others had long ignored, producing resources, knowledge, and innovations that began to shift the balance of power. Ethan Vale had changed too. The young diplomat who had once walked silently from Zarathus' throne room was now Admiral Ethan Vale, a leader of respect and quiet authority. His hair was streaked with gray, his face lined with years of careful planning and thoughtful decisions, but his eyes still held the same calm determination that had never wavered in his youth. He moved with purpose, his mind always calculating, always observing. In the command room of his flagship, Resolute, Ethan watched a star map that spanned several light years. Blue markers represented human colonies, some fully developed, some growing slowly. Red markers showed Zarathus and its neighboring systems. Ethan studied them with patience, noticing not just what existed, but what could be achieved with careful action. "Admiral," said Lieutenant Mara, a young but talented officer, breaking his concentration, "we've received reports from the Outer Rim colonies. They are stable, but some systems are asking for more support in trade and defense." Ethan nodded. "Good, we will send assistance quietly. Let them see humans not as conquerors, but as reliable partners. That is the strength of patience, an influence that spreads without overt force." He knew that the galaxy valued power, but it also respected wisdom. Humans had learned this early. They did not need to shout or threaten. They needed to act carefully, letting their success speak. That was how they had survived centuries of skepticism. Far across the galaxy on Zarathus, the capital was abuzz with tension. Queen Lyra walked through her palace corridors, her posture regal, yet her mind weighed heavily with worry. The alien council had grown restless. Some members questioned her decisions, suggesting that she was too lenient in trade negotiations with other systems. Others whispered that human colonies were becoming too influential, spreading ideas and technology that could rival Zarathus itself. Lyra paused before a holographic display. It showed human fleets marked in blue, moving steadily but not aggressively. She studied each vessel, noting their formations and the intelligence behind them. A part of her remembered the human who had walked into her court so many years ago. At the time, she had laughed at him. Now she felt something different: curiosity, respect, and a hint of unease. Ethan's reputation had quietly grown over decades. Reports from other species described him as calm but unstoppable, a leader who acted decisively but without arrogance. His name was mentioned with caution and respect in council meetings across the galaxy. Yet he never sought fame. His actions were deliberate, calculated, and, most importantly, silent in their power. On the human side, the strategy was simple: observation, preparation, and subtle influence. Ethan had long realized that rushing into conflict was unnecessary. The galaxy moved at its own pace, and those who waited, learned, and acted with precision often became the most formidable. Humanity's rise was not loud or flashy, but undeniable. A meeting in the Human Command Center brought together Ethan and his closest advisors. They reviewed trade routes, intelligence reports, and fleet movements. Each piece of information was considered carefully. Decisions were made not out of pride, but out of logic and foresight. "Some alien factions are showing signs of tension," Ethan said calmly, pointing to the display. "Zarathus is central, but the influence of other species is spreading. We must be ready to respond, not with aggression, but with solutions. Offer stability where others create chaos." Lieutenant Mara raised an eyebrow. "So we act as advisors and partners, not conquerors?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Exactly. Humans have learned that respect is earned through action, not through loud claims. Let our work speak." Meanwhile, Queen Lyra was unaware of the silent plans forming in human colonies. She faced her own challenges: rebellions in distant provinces, dissent among the council, and pressure from rival planets. Her advisors urged her to act quickly, to show strength through power displays, but she hesitated. The galaxy was changing, and brute force was no longer the only measure of influence. Lyra remembered the human from long ago, the young diplomat who had faced ridicule without fear. She could not explain why his memory lingered after all these years. Perhaps it was his calm demeanor, his quiet confidence, or the strange strength in his silence. Whatever it was, she felt that humans had more depth than she had ever considered. Back on the flagship Resolute, Ethan continued planning. He reviewed communication logs from colonies in the Outer Rim, focusing on the subtle ways humans had improved local governance, trade efficiency, and defense. Each success was small, often unnoticed by larger powers, but they accumulated, forming a web of influence across the stars. "Admiral," Mara said again, "Zarathus' political instability could be an opportunity. Should we engage directly?" Ethan shook his head. "Not yet. Direct engagement risks attention and conflict. Let them face their challenges. We will offer assistance quietly, providing solutions that benefit everyone. That is how humans shape the galaxy. Without confrontation, without prideful display. Results matter more than words." The philosophy had guided him for decades. Humanity's rise was like water slowly carving canyons through stone. It was persistent, patient, and unstoppable in its quiet way. On Zarathus, Lyra convened a meeting of her council. Voices rose in debate, some demanding action against human expansion. Others suggested diplomatic approaches, but the disagreements grew heated. Lyra remained silent, observing. She realized that leadership required more than authority. It required judgment, patience, and insight. She remembered the human who had walked away silently all those years ago. Perhaps there was a lesson in his quiet strength. Ethan's influence began to touch Zarathus indirectly. Human technology, trade systems, and political advice reached allied species, strengthening their systems without drawing attention. Rumors of human ingenuity spread, sometimes dismissed, sometimes feared, but always noted. The galaxy was starting to recognize that humans were not weak. They were deliberate, disciplined, and resilient. Weeks later, a small fleet of human envoys arrived at a nearby neutral system. Their mission was simple: provide assistance in trade organization, repair a few satellites, and train local administrators. They did so without fanfare, without demands, and without seeking recognition. Yet by the time they left, the system had become more stable, more efficient, and more loyal to human principles. Back on Zarathus, reports of these human actions reached the Queen. Lyra studied them carefully. She felt a mix of irritation and admiration. The humans were clever, effective, and silent. She realized that her laughter from 27 years ago might have been premature. Humans were no longer insignificant. They were growing in ways she had not expected. Ethan received reports of her attention but remained indifferent. His goal was not recognition or revenge. He had long understood that power earned through action carried far more weight than any title or crown. The galaxy was changing, and humanity's influence was expanding not by force but by intelligence, diligence, and calm. In the quiet of his cabin, Ethan looked out at the stars again. Each point of light represented potential, opportunity, and responsibility. He had learned to move slowly, act wisely, and let his decisions speak. The galaxy was vast, and humans had only begun to leave their mark. Lyra, meanwhile, began to see the subtle shift. The systems around Zarathus were more organized, more stable, and more influenced by humans than she had realized. The small steps that humans had taken quietly over decades had grown into something she could not ignore. Ethan's plan did not rely on intimidation or threat. It relied on intelligence, patience, and resilience, qualities that humans possessed in abundance. The rise of humanity was not a story of loud conquest but of quiet mastery, and the galaxy was beginning to take notice. Queen Lyra could not dismiss it any longer. The human she had mocked 27 years ago was no longer small, no longer insignificant. Across light years, humanity had risen, guided by principles that required discipline, foresight, and patience, and somewhere deep inside her, Lyra realized that the story of that quiet human, who had once left her court without a single word of complaint, was far from over. The galaxy was watching, and soon, the full measure of human determination would reveal itself, not in loud displays, but in results that could not be ignored. The Galactic Summit was held on Arendor Prime, a planet of shimmering glass cities and wide oceans that reflected the twin suns above. Leaders from countless star systems gathered in the Grand Assembly Hall. Each species carried its own customs, pride, and ambitions, but today they were here to discuss trade, diplomacy, and security in a galaxy that was quietly shifting. Ethan Vale entered the summit calmly. His uniform was simple but immaculate. Unlike some leaders who preferred grand displays of wealth or power, Ethan moved with quiet confidence. His presence drew no laughter, no mocking whispers. Yet there was a subtle weight to him, a sense that his actions mattered more than words could ever express. Queen Lyra, now seated on her throne-like chair in the summit's central platform, recognized him immediately. Her heart skipped slightly, not from fear but from the recognition that this human, once small and easily mocked, had grown into a figure she could not dismiss. She kept her composure, hiding her surprise beneath the mask of a queen. As the summit began, delegates from various systems presented their points. Disputes arose over trade routes, territorial claims, and technological patents. The debates were loud, sharp, and sometimes hostile. Many species assumed humanity would be sidelined. They expected humans to be quiet observers, perhaps polite but insignificant. Ethan listened quietly. He spoke only when necessary, his words measured and precise. When he offered solutions, they were simple, effective, and difficult to argue against. He suggested trade regulations that allowed disputed systems to cooperate, designed defense pacts that reduced tensions without escalating conflict, and offered technology-sharing plans that benefited multiple species without giving humans overt dominance. The other leaders began to notice. Murmurs spread through the hall. Some aliens whispered that Ethan's calm, intelligent approach carried a subtle authority. Others frowned, wondering why a human had so much influence despite decades of supposed insignificance. Lyra observed him closely. She remembered the laughter from 27 years ago, the ridicule she had shared with her court. Now she could feel the power of his presence, not through words, not through loud gestures, but through intelligence and quiet strategy. The human she had mocked had become something far greater than she had anticipated. One of the alien delegates, a tall being with silver skin and sharp eyes, challenged Ethan openly. "Human, your systems are small. How can you suggest policies for the galaxy when your colonies barely span the outer rim?" Ethan smiled, faintly unshaken. "Even small systems can serve as examples. Order and cooperation can spread faster than force. My proposals are meant to strengthen alliances, not to dominate. Results, not size, define influence." The council members exchanged uneasy glances. Ethan's words were calm, but their meaning was undeniable. He had not boasted, nor had he threatened. Yet the logic and precision of his plans left little room for opposition. Lyra leaned forward slightly. For the first time in decades, she felt a mixture of respect and unease. She realized that this human had mastered something many alien leaders had never understood: influence without arrogance, power without display, strategy without threat. As the summit continued, Ethan quietly built a network of allies. Systems that were neutral or skeptical began to support his proposals. His methods were subtle. He never forced opinions, never demanded recognition. He shared knowledge, offered solutions, and allowed the benefits to speak for themselves. Slowly, his influence spread across the assembly hall like a silent shadow, touching every corner without making noise. Meanwhile, Lyra faced growing challenges. Several members of her council criticized her for allowing humans to gain influence. "They are small, weak, and inexperienced," one counselor said. "Why allow them to shape our policies?" Lyra's eyes narrowed. "Because intelligence and results matter more than size," she replied quietly. "You will see that strength comes in many forms." The counselor scoffed, but Lyra remained unmoved. She had learned over the years that rash judgments often led to failure. Patience, observation, and careful decisions were sometimes more powerful than fleets or weapons. Yet she could not ignore the lingering thought that this human, Ethan Vale, was teaching her a lesson she had never expected. During a break in the summit, Ethan walked through the hall, observing quietly. He saw leaders arguing, strategists planning, and spies noting every movement. He understood that the galaxy was a complex web, and influence moved not through shouting but through subtle action. A young delegate approached him cautiously. "Admiral Vale, may I ask a question?" "Of course," Ethan replied, his tone calm. "How did humans rise so quietly, yet effectively?" the delegate asked. Ethan considered the question. "We learned patience. We learned to act when the moment was right. We do not boast, we do not mock. We observe, we plan, and we act with precision. Influence comes from results, not words." The delegate nodded, impressed. "It is unlike anything the galaxy has seen." Ethan smiled faintly. "Perhaps. But it is not about being different. It is about being consistent and wise." Back at the summit, tensions rose when a dispute over a distant trade route threatened to explode into conflict. Delegates shouted, accusations flew, and for a moment it seemed the entire meeting would collapse into chaos. Ethan stood and raised a hand, not in threat, but in calm assertion. "We are here to create stability," he said simply. "If we focus on shared interests, we can find solutions that benefit everyone. Let us remember that cooperation ensures survival, while conflict only weakens us." The room fell silent. His words were not loud, but the authority behind them could not be ignored. Slowly, delegates began to consider his proposals. Discussions turned from accusations to solutions. Disputes were reframed into compromises. The human who had once been mocked had demonstrated the quiet power of intellect and composure. Lyra watched from her platform. She felt a mixture of pride and frustration. Pride because she recognized the skill and wisdom of this human. Frustration because she had underestimated him so many years ago. Yet she could not deny the truth. Ethan Vale had become a figure whose influence could not be ignored. By the end of the summit, a new agreement was drafted. Trade routes were secured, defense pacts strengthened, and knowledge-sharing initiatives established. Humans were acknowledged not through arrogance or force, but through careful, precise action. Their influence was subtle, yet undeniable. As delegates prepared to leave, Lyra approached Ethan. For a moment, the Queen and the human who had once faced ridicule stood face to face. Neither spoke immediately. The hall was filled with chatter, but in that quiet moment, respect passed silently between them. "You have grown," Lyra said finally, her voice calm but carrying weight. "Humans are not as insignificant as I once believed." Ethan inclined his head slightly. "Thank you, Your Highness. We have learned that influence comes not from pride, but from careful action." Lyra studied him for a moment, recalling the young diplomat who had walked away quietly from her throne room 27 years ago. That human had left without complaint, without bitterness, and now, the man before her had shaped the galaxy in ways she could not ignore. The summit concluded with leaders returning to their home systems, carrying new plans and agreements. Humans had left their mark again, silently and efficiently. No one had needed to witness grandeur or spectacle. The results themselves spoke louder than words, louder than fleets, louder than any throne room laughter. Ethan returned to his ship, observing the stars once more. Every system, every light represented opportunity and potential. The galaxy was vast, and humans were no longer insignificant observers. They were participants, influencers, and quiet shapers of the future. On Zarathus, Lyra walked through her palace in reflection. She realized that mocking a human decades ago had been a mistake, not because of insult, but because she had underestimated the quiet strength of patience, intellect, and composure. That small human had grown into a figure whose influence stretched across stars, a reminder that strength is often measured not in appearance, but in action. Ethan, the silent strategist, the quiet shadow of influence, had begun to show the galaxy the true power of humanity. And Queen Lyra, once amused by his presence, now faced a new reality. Humans were not just rising. They were shaping the galaxy itself, one careful step at a time. Zarathus was not a quiet planet. Its cities glimmered under twin suns, but political tension had begun to darken even the brightest streets. The alien council was divided. Some factions demanded aggressive action against humans, believing that their rising influence threatened Zarathus' supremacy. Others urged caution, arguing that rash decisions could destabilize the planet's trade and diplomacy. Queen Lyra moved through her palace corridors, her mind heavy with responsibility. She had always known leadership required wisdom, but now the weight of her choices pressed down like a mountain. She remembered the human who had once walked into her throne room so calmly, the one she had mocked decades ago. At the time, his silence had annoyed her. Now that memory haunted her, for she knew the human's influence had quietly spread across the galaxy. Meanwhile, Ethan Vale was far away, observing reports from his flagship Resolute. Intelligence indicated unrest on Zarathus, including rebel uprisings in outlying provinces. These were not simple disagreements, they were challenges to Lyra's authority. But Ethan did not rush into the situation with fleets or threats. He knew that timing and strategy were far more powerful than brute force. "Admiral," said Lieutenant Mara, studying the incoming reports, "the rebels are growing bolder. Some systems are threatening to break away entirely. Should we intervene directly?" Ethan shook his head. "Direct confrontation will only escalate. We will act, but carefully. Offer guidance, support, and solutions quietly. Let our presence stabilize without being noticed as interference." His strategy was simple in theory, complex in execution. Humans had always understood the power of subtle influence. By helping systems stabilize themselves, providing technology, communication networks, and organization, Ethan could ensure Zarathus remained intact without making it appear as though humans were controlling events. On Zarathus, Lyra convened an emergency council. Voices rose, some accusing her of weakness, others warning that human influence was growing too strong. Lyra listened, her eyes steady, her mind calm. She remembered the young human diplomat who had left her court without protest. His silent composure had left a mark that years had only magnified. We face threats not because humans are aggressive, she said quietly, but because we have failed to see change coming. Our challenge is not to fight what is, but to adapt, the council murmured. Some were frustrated, others confused. Lyra's words carried weight, but she knew that action, not speeches, would define her reign. Meanwhile, small human teams arrived at troubled systems near Zarathus. They did not storm cities or impose authority. Instead, they repaired infrastructure, facilitated communication, and trained local leaders. Slowly, the systems regained stability. Trade resumed. Tensions eased. And yet, there was no sign of human fleets threatening Zarathus directly. The humans were invisible in their influence, like shadows moving behind the scenes. Lyra began to notice patterns. Reports of peaceful resolutions, efficient systems, and improved governance all pointed to human involvement. She felt a mix of surprise and respect. The human she had mocked 27 years ago was now shaping events quietly, without demanding recognition or credit. Then came the moment that would test both leaders. A faction of Zarathian rebels launched a coordinated attack on one of the outer provinces, threatening both civilians and infrastructure. The council panicked. "Send the fleets! Crush them now," shouted one member. Others argued for negotiation, but the chaos was growing. Lyra realized that action needed precision, not anger. She contacted Ethan, not as an ally to fight, but as a strategist to guide. "Admiral Vale," she spoke into the secure channel. "Your people have helped stabilize systems. Now we face an open rebellion. I need advice," Ethan's calm voice replied. "Your Highness, the key is coordination. Direct confrontation will escalate. Instead, focus on communication. Contain the threat and use local leaders to regain trust. We will provide tactical support, not fleets of warships." Lyra hesitated for only a moment. She had learned that humans did not act rashly. Their quiet judgment carried wisdom. Following Ethan's advice, she ordered precise strikes to cut off rebel supply lines, while simultaneously sending negotiators and aid teams to regain loyalty among civilians. The operation unfolded with precision. Human teams provided communication systems and logistical support, allowing Lyra's forces to act efficiently. Within days, the rebellion lost momentum. Systems that had teetered on the edge of collapse stabilized. Trade routes reopened, and civilians returned to normal life. Lyra observed the results with quiet awe. The human influence had saved her planet without overt force, without showing dominance, without arrogance. The man she had mocked long ago had demonstrated a skill far beyond combat, the power of intelligence, patience, and silent guidance. In a council meeting after the rebellion, Lyra addressed her advisors. "The humans' methods are subtle yet effective. Their influence is not through threat, but through results. We have underestimated them. That will not happen again," her counselors murmured uneasily. Some were frustrated that Zarathus's safety had depended on human guidance, even indirectly. Others realized that this quiet strategy was more effective than any fleet could be. Back on Resolute, Ethan reviewed the reports. The rebellion had been quelled without unnecessary bloodshed. Human methods had strengthened Zarathus, and indirectly, humanity's reputation had grown. Ethan did not celebrate. He understood that influence was not measured in applause, but in outcomes. He allowed himself a moment of satisfaction before turning to the next report. Another system in need of guidance. Another opportunity to quietly shape the galaxy. Lyra, meanwhile, reflected on her own pride. She remembered mocking Ethan when he had first visited Zarathus. At the time, she had thought humans were weak, insignificant, and unworthy of respect. Now she understood that she had misjudged him entirely. Strength was not always loud. Influence was not always immediate. Patience, intelligence, and action carried far more power than mockery or pride. For the first time, Lyra approached Ethan, not as a queen to a foreign diplomat, but as a leader recognizing the quiet brilliance of another. They met in a secure chamber away from prying eyes. "Admiral Vale," she said softly, "I misjudged you decades ago. Your methods, your patience, they are remarkable." Ethan inclined his head respectfully. "Thank you, Your Highness. Humans have learned that action matters more than words. Influence comes from results, not arrogance." Lyra studied him for a long moment. "You have shown that even a small presence can shape the galaxy. That is something I did not fully understand when I laughed at you all those years ago." Ethan remained calm. He had no need for revenge or pride. His work spoke for itself, and it had already shaped the future of countless systems. History is not about mocking, Your Highness. It is about learning, adapting, and acting wisely. Lyra nodded slowly. In that moment, the Queen understood the silent power humans carried. It was not a force that demanded attention, but one that quietly earned respect and reshaped the future. The crisis on Zarathus had passed, but the lessons remained. Humans had risen not by shouting, not by showing dominance, but by acting with intelligence, patience, and precision. The galaxy had begun to notice, and Queen Lyra knew deep inside that the human who had once walked out of her throne room quietly was no longer just a figure in her memory. He was a force in the galaxy, one whose influence could not be ignored, and whose methods had taught her a lesson she would never forget. The shadow of Ethan Vale had grown long and silent, stretching across light years, reshaping the galaxy without a single boast. And Zarathus, once a world of laughter at human weakness, had learned that strength often comes quietly, and power is measured not by noise, but by results. As the stars glittered above both Zarathus and the human colonies, two leaders, one alien, one human, understood a shared truth. The galaxy was changing, and quiet wisdom often outweighed arrogance. The human who had once been mocked had become a silent architect of the future, and nothing would ever be the same again. The galaxy had shifted quietly but unmistakably. Human influence stretched across systems, stabilizing trade routes, improving governance, and offering guidance without fanfare or threat. Yet no human fleet had fired a shot. No human diplomat had boasted. The power of humanity was subtle, patient, and undeniable. Queen Lyra sat in her palace on Zarathus, overlooking the bustling city below. She had faced countless challenges during her reign, but none had taught her as much as observing the humans. The memory of a young diplomat walking silently from her throne room 27 years ago had evolved into a profound respect for the species he represented. That small, quiet figure had grown into someone whose decisions now touched the fate of the galaxy. The ceremonial hall on Zarathus was prepared for a historic gathering. Leaders from dozens of systems had arrived to acknowledge new agreements, celebrate the stabilization of multiple troubled regions, and honor individuals whose efforts had brought lasting peace. Among them, Ethan Vale entered calmly, his presence commanding without demanding attention. The Council of Zarathus observed him closely. Murmurs passed through the room. Some whispered that the human had grown into a force no one could ignore. Others noted the quiet confidence he carried, a composure that seemed to radiate authority without arrogance. Lyra stood as Ethan approached the platform. The room fell into respectful silence. She remembered the laughter she had shared with her council decades ago. She had mocked him then, but now, she recognized the truth. Humans were patient, intelligent, and capable of influence far beyond what appearances suggested. "You have done much for the galaxy, Admiral Vale," Lyra said, her voice steady and clear. "Your actions have stabilized systems, saved countless lives, and shown that wisdom and patience can achieve what force alone cannot." Ethan inclined his head respectfully. "Thank you, Your Highness. Humanity has learned that quiet action, careful planning, and steadfastness are often more powerful than any display of strength. We seek not praise, but results." The council observed silently, realizing the truth in Ethan's words. They had witnessed conflicts, political unrest, and rebellions. Humans had arrived not as conquerors, but as guides, offering solutions without demanding recognition. That was a power many alien leaders had never understood. Quiet influence achieved through patience, intelligence, and integrity. Lyra turned to the other leaders. "Let this gathering remind us that the galaxy's strength lies not only in fleets and weapons, but in the wisdom to act judiciously. Humans have shown that even without size or force, one can shape the future through thoughtful action." Across the room, delegates nodded. Some smiled quietly, others looked thoughtful. The lesson was clear. Results, not loud proclamations, carried weight. The human who had once been mocked had proven it through decades of careful, deliberate effort. After the formal acknowledgments, a small reception allowed leaders to mingle. Ethan moved calmly through the room, speaking only when asked, listening carefully, offering guidance in quiet words. His influence spread subtly, like ripples in water, affecting conversations, decisions, and plans without overt display. Lyra observed him. She had once judged humans as small, weak and insignificant. Now she understood that she had misjudged them. Strength was not always obvious. It could be silent, patient, and unwavering. Ethan embodied that truth. Later, Lyra requested a private audience. She and Ethan met in a chamber overlooking the city. Far from the formalities of the council and delegates, the twin suns bathed the room in golden light, casting long shadows that stretched across polished floors. "You have shown remarkable skill, Admiral Vale," Lyra said, her tone sincere, not just in strategy but in patience, judgment, and quiet influence. "I misjudged humans 27 years ago. I underestimated what you and your species could achieve." Ethan nodded calmly. "Your Highness, humans have learned that influence is measured by outcomes, not applause. That is the lesson we have carried through every challenge. Power without wisdom is fragile, but patient action is enduring." Lyra studied him closely. "It seems I have learned that lesson as well. Your presence, your methods, they have shaped not just systems but perspectives. You have shown the galaxy that humans are capable of far more than many expected." Ethan's expression remained humble. He did not seek praise. He understood that respect earned through actions was far more powerful than any words of acknowledgement. "Thank you, Your Highness. That is all we can hope for. To do what is right, and let the results speak." For a long moment, Lyra reflected on the years that had passed. The young diplomat who had walked silently from her throne room had become a figure whose decisions now impacted countless systems. The galaxy had changed not because humans boasted, but because they acted with intelligence, patience, and consistency. "Your silence once spoke louder than any words," Lyra said softly, "and now your actions have spoken louder than anyone could have imagined. I hope you understand how much respect you have earned, not just from me, but from all who observe your work." Ethan inclined his head in acknowledgement. "I understand, Your Highness. Respect is earned, not demanded, and influence is most lasting when it guides rather than forces." The private meeting ended, but the message remained. Across Zarathus and the galaxy, the quiet strength of humans had been proven. No one could dismiss them now. Not because of fleets, not because of titles, but because results spoke for themselves. Systems were stable, trade routes were secure, and alliances strengthened, all thanks to careful planning, patience, and intelligent action. In the days following the summit, Zarathus began implementing broader cooperation with human-led initiatives. Trade, technology, and communication networks expanded. Alien leaders who had doubted humanity now studied their methods. Diplomats from other species began asking for guidance, seeking advice on how to replicate the quiet but effective approach humans had demonstrated. Lyra watched as her council adapted. Some members still struggled with the idea of human influence, but others recognized its undeniable value. Slowly, respect replaced skepticism. She realized that mocking humans decades ago had been a mistake, but learning from them now had become an opportunity. Ethan returned to his flagship after the ceremonies. He looked out at the stars, reflecting on the quiet victories humans had achieved. Influence without arrogance, strategy without threat, results without boast. These were the principles that had guided them across decades, and they had worked. He thought of the galaxy ahead, of systems yet to be stabilized, of alliances yet to be strengthened. The work was far from over, but the lesson remained clear. Humans did not need to shout to be heard. Their actions carried power, and their results shaped futures. On Zarathus, Lyra stood in her palace balcony, gazing at the distant stars. Somewhere across those vast distances, humans were moving carefully, quietly, shaping systems and societies without fanfare. She felt a mixture of pride and humility. The human she had once mocked had taught her a lesson about patience, intelligence, and quiet power. The galaxy had witnessed the rise of humanity. Not through noise or spectacle, but through careful, consistent, and intelligent action. And the silent shadow of Ethan Vale stretched across light years, guiding outcomes, stabilizing systems, and demonstrating the quiet might of a species once underestimated. In time, the story of that young diplomat who had walked silently from Zarathus's throne room became legend. It was no longer a tale of mockery, but a story of dignity, patience, and influence. Humans were respected, not feared, admired, not envied, and Queen Lyra, once amused by his presence, now understood the full measure of human capability. Ethan's silent exit had spoken louder than words decades ago. Now his actions had spoken louder than empires. Humanity's patience, intelligence, and quiet power had reshaped the galaxy. And the future would remember that sometimes the strongest voice is the one that chooses silence and lets results speak for themselves. As the twin suns set over Zarathus, casting golden light across the city, two leaders, one alien, one human, stood in reflection. Both understood that the galaxy had changed, and that quiet wisdom and action often outweighed arrogance, pride, and mockery. The story had come full circle. Respect earned, influence proven, and humanity's rise undeniable. The galaxy watched silently, but it had learned a powerful truth. Humans, once underestimated, had quietly become a force that shaped worlds, guided systems, and left a mark no one could ignore.